Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I saw that my friend Mr. Terry did this one a few days ago, so I thought I'd take a look at it myself. This is from the Paint Explainer, who has almost 1.7 million subscribers now. He's doing quite well, and this is one that has 3 million views already just in the 2 weeks that it's been out. It's going to be a bit of a controversial topic, but it's the kind of thing that we definitely need to talk about to have a full complete picture of history. This is every major U.S. war crime in 20 minutes. And I'm looking at the thumbnail, and I do see at least one or two that I can think of that aren't there. So if you think of one that doesn't get mentioned in this video today, let us know in the comment section below. Obviously, everybody has their own description of what is a war crime versus what is just what happens in war. Some people would say that the atomic bombs were war crimes. Some people would say the firebombing of Dresden or of cities in Japan, that those were war crimes. There are people in the South who think that the March to the Sea was a war crime. So everybody has their own thoughts on that, but let's go ahead and dive into this one.
My Lai Massacre. On the 16th of March 1968, in the Vietnamese village called Sun Mai, U.S. soldiers carried out what became the largest massacre of civilians by American forces in the 20th century. Between 347 and 504 unarmed villagers, most of them women, children, and the elderly, were killed.
So you might ask yourself, how on earth do we not know? You know, that's 150 or so difference between one number and the other. It just depends on the source. The 300, the low number there, I believe, is the official U.S. military number, which it's impressive that we even acknowledge that there were that many. Other sources have the higher number.
Many women and girls, some as young as 12, were raped before being murdered.
Yeah.
Bodies were mutilated, homes were burned, and livestock was slaughtered.
Yeah, here's the thing. You can't even, like you could try to make an argument that, you know, this is the nature of this kind of warfare when you're dealing with irregular combat, where often civilians are like bombing and doing different things, and you know, a lot of that kind of stuff was happening. But you can't even make the argument that, well, we didn't know who the enemy was, because the only way you could even try to make that argument is if you just killed them. But the fact that they were committing these other kinds of atrocities on these young girls especially shows that they weren't even pretending like this was combat. This was just straight up evil is what it was.
Witnesses described women using their bodies to shield children, only for soldiers to fire into them. One ditch alone held more than 70 dead. Then, platoons went hut to hut, killing entire families, bayoneting the wounded, and throwing grenades. Soldiers later testified that their orders had been to destroy everything, leave nothing, and treat anyone still there as the enemy. One soldier intentionally shot himself in the foot to avoid taking part. A few, like Michael Bernhardt, refused to kill and later helped expose what happened. The massacre might have been even worse if not for Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson Jr. and his helicopter crew. Flying low over the village, they saw women and children being slaughtered, and at one point, Thompson landed between U.S. soldiers and terrified civilians, ordering his own gunners to fire on Americans if they kept killing. He personally evacuated survivors by helicopter, saving dozens.
When these kinds of horrible things happen, when war happens, and this is going to be a common theme through all of these, we've talked about this before, is that when you remove the restraints of a civilized society that normally exist, like for us every day right now, when you remove those restraints and you put people into combat zones where their very worst nature can come out, plus you put on top of that the stress and the nature of the kind of jungle and irregular warfare that's going on in this war, you throw all of that in there, and some people they just stop acting like human beings. But other people, it brings out the very best in them, and we see that there with, I believe there were 3 men who were actually recognized by the U.S. military as going out of their way to try to stop this.
First, the massacre was reported as a great victory, claiming that 128 Viet Cong were killed, and the unit was congratulated. Officers up the chain of command worked to hide the truth, but later on, when veterans like Ronald Ridenhour spoke out and journalist Seymour Hersh investigated, the world learned the real story. When photographs surfaced showing women, children, and babies piled in ditches, what happened could no longer be denied. In the end, 26 soldiers were charged, but only one, Lieutenant Calley, was convicted. He was found guilty of murdering 22 villagers and sentenced to life in prison, but he served 3.5 years under house arrest after President Nixon intervened.
Yeah, this is really the stuff that infuriates me about this is that we as the United States military and as the government had an opportunity, while we couldn't undo what was done, we had an opportunity to use this to say, you know what, when we hold people like at Nuremberg, when we hold the Germans accountable for the things that they did, we're also going to hold ourselves accountable for these things. And the absolute crap show that this trial ended up being, not only that only one guy even got convicted in the first place, and that was the commanding officer of this unit, but that then he basically got off scot-free and was able to live out his life, despite the fact that he and his men massacred upwards of 500 people. It's just a real shame and a real stain on the U.S. that we basically brushed it under the rug and said, oops. And, you know, this makes me wonder, too, how many times did things like this happen that we've never heard about? There's an example of one that isn't on the list for this video, where in the aftermath of the massacre that happened like something like 80 or 90 American troops during the Battle of the Bulge, the 11th Armored Division turned around and massacred a bunch of German soldiers. And for the most part, it was covered up. And the only reason we really know any of the details of it is because General Patton wrote about it in his diary and did his best to make sure that it never came out. So, there's probably a lot more stories like this that we've never heard.
Medina, accused of giving the orders, was acquitted. Most others escaped punishment. Survivors, many of them children at the time, carried the trauma for decades. One recalled, "Everyone in my family was killed.
Wow.
They threw me into a ditch full of dead bodies. I was covered with blood and brains." Haditha Massacre. On the morning of November 19, 2005, in the Iraqi town of Haditha, a roadside bomb tore through a U.S. Marine convoy. The explosion killed a Marine instantly and left 2 other Marines badly wounded. Within hours, that turned into one of the darkest chapters of the Iraq War. The Marines shot 5 unarmed men who had been ordered out of their taxi, killing them on the spot. Then, they entered nearby houses. Inside were families with grandparents, parents, and children as young as 1 year old. Nonetheless, 19 civilians were killed in their homes, most shot at close range in the chest or head. By the end of the day, 25 unarmed civilians were dead, with the youngest victim being just 3 years old. The Marine Corps' first official story was false. They claimed that 15 civilians had been killed by the roadside bomb, and that 8 insurgents died in a firefight afterward. However, an Iraqi human rights worker filmed the aftermath: bullet holes in walls, bloodstains on floors, and bodies of women and children with gunshot wounds. A Time magazine reporter then began investigating and found that doctors at the local hospital confirmed that none of the bodies showed bomb injuries, but close-range gunshot wounds. A 9-year-old girl who survived said she saw her grandfather shot first in the chest and then in the head, followed by her grandmother. Investigations stretched on for years, and at first, 8 Marines were charged, but case after case collapsed. Some Marines received immunity in exchange for testimony, while others had their charges dropped. By 2008, nearly all charges were gone, and the only Marine punished was Vuterik. He admitted to negligent dereliction of duty, lost rank and pay, but avoided jail. For many Iraqis, this outcome was unbearable, as families who had lost multiple relatives in one morning saw 6 years of U.S. military prosecution end without a single Marine imprisoned. Survivors called it an assault on humanity. Lawyers for the victims urged international courts to take up the case. Meanwhile, the U.S. military paid $38,000 in compensation to some families.
To be honest with you, and 2005 was a time when I was still paying pretty close attention to everyday news. I was watching daily news stories, and probably for another 5 to 10 years after that, I stayed pretty close to the news until I just kind of stopped watching it because it just was horrible. I don't remember ever hearing about this, and I'm curious to know the details and if there's another side to this. I'm not saying there is. I'm just curious to know if there was an argument made by anybody that it wasn't the Marines who did it. But I know this kind of stuff happens in war, though, so I wouldn't be surprised that it happened that way. But I just honestly have never heard anything about that. Okay, so I took a little time to read up on this, and it does sound like, the young child who said he was an eyewitness didn't actually see that it was Marines. He just saw the guns. So there weren't any eyewitnesses that could directly say, okay, we saw Marines doing this, but it appears pretty apparent from the actions of the higher-ups and the investigation that was done by the U.S. that at the very least they acknowledged that something went terribly wrong with this. So I think there probably is a lot of truth to this.
Our campaign. "Kill everyone over the age of 10." Those were the words of General Jacob H. Smith during the Philippine-American War in what became known as the Pacification of Samar. His order did not apply only to armed enemy fighters, but to everyone, as he wanted to turn the island into, in his own words, a howling wilderness. The situation leading up to this was already tense, as just months earlier, Filipino fighters together with local townspeople had carried out the Balangiga massacre, where in a surprise attack, they killed 54 and wounded 18 U.S. soldiers.
So you'll notice a common theme here is that in a lot of these situations, these are circumstances in which you have what I referred to earlier as kind of an irregular war, where very often you're dealing with the U.S. being this big superpower with a powerful military fighting against a weaker populace that's not as well armed, and so they tend to resort to guerrilla tactics, often have civilians involved and things of that nature. And you know, the U.S. has been on the other side of that, where that's kind of the war we fought against the British. So this in no way excuses war crimes. They shouldn't happen, period. But there does seem to be a common theme that when men are put into those situations, the stress seems to get to them. And, you know, the very nature of that kind of war leads to them killing civilians who they might suspect or blame for actions by previous civilians.
That's when the U.S. government sent General Smith to Samar, who made it clear that he wanted no prisoners and asked for everyone capable of bearing arms to be killed. When Marines asked him what exactly capable of bearing arms meant, Smith explained that it meant boys as young as 10 years old. Waller himself, the major leading these Marines, partly resisted these instructions, telling some of his officers not to target women and children. Still, over just 11 days, he reported that his men burned 255 homes and killed 39 people. Civilians saw their towns and food reduced to ashes. The number of deaths will never be fully known, but broader estimates suggest around 2,000 to 2,500 civilians were killed. The campaign became infamous in the United States once reports reached home, and Smith was put on trial in May 1902, but not for murder or war crimes. Instead, he was found guilty only of conduct to the prejudice of good order and military discipline.
That seems to be a common theme with this too, is that the military tends to view these acts as just a breakdown in discipline. That was kind of the route they went with what happened in that Iraqi massacre, where it was just like, well, yeah, there was bad discipline here, and the chain of command failed, and the officers should have had better control of their men. But they never go the step to say this is an actual crime, this is actual murder that needs to be punished.
Charge. His punishment was just a formal reprimand. To calm public anger, he was quietly forced into retirement. Waller himself was also later put on trial for ordering the execution of Filipino porters, but he was acquitted. Nisour Square Massacre.
Not sure.
This one was different from the others. It happened without warning, and not by the regular U.S. Army, but by a private contractor known as Blackwater, which made it even more controversial. On a normal morning in September 2007, a Blackwater convoy drove into Nisour Square in Baghdad to clear a route for U.S. officials. Moments later, though, out of nowhere, they opened fire on Iraqi civilians. 17 people were killed, and 20 more were wounded. Some were shot while still sitting in their cars.
And so speaking of chain of command, when you start having these paramilitary organizations, these external organizations that aren't inside of the regular military chain of command, it's even harder to deal with them and to kind of make sure that they don't do stuff like this.
In their cars. For example, witnesses described one small Kia with a mother and her adult son inside. The son was shot in the head, and the car kept moving forward and was riddled with more bullets before a grenade set it on fire. Blackwater claimed the convoy had been ambushed and that the guards fired in self-defense, but the Iraqi government called it an unprovoked attack.
And you know what? It may be that they were ambushed, just like in the other story we just talked about, there was an IED that killed a soldier or killed a Marine. But it doesn't make it right then that in retaliating, you go after the wrong people.
The State Department admitted that innocent people had been killed, and Iraq suspended Blackwater's license to operate in its territory and demanded accountability. Several
Fair.
investigations began, and a U.S. military report supported Iraq's version of events, saying Blackwater was at fault. The FBI concluded that at least 14 of the 17 people killed had been shot without justification. Some Blackwater guards themselves told investigators that the shooting was wrong. One guard even kept firing after others shouted for him to stop, until another contractor aimed his weapon at him to force him to stand down. The massacre raised questions about the role of private military contractors, and Iraq demanded punishment for Blackwater and
All
pressed
fair.
for compensation. In the U.S., the House passed a bill to bring contractors under U.S. criminal law in war zones, though the
That's good. But
Senate did not vote on it. Then, the State Department told Blackwater its security contract would not be renewed, and years later, the case reached U.S. courts. In 2014, 4 Blackwater guards were convicted in federal court. One of them was sentenced to life in prison, while the others received 30 years each under firearms laws. There were some appeals, but in the end, the man originally sentenced to life was once again given life in prison, while the other 3 had their sentences reduced to about half of what they were before. Later on, however, there was a final twist. In December 2020, President Donald Trump pardoned all 4 men.
What?
The decision triggered outrage in Iraq and harsh criticism from United Nations experts, who said the pardons violated U.S. obligations under international law.
absolutely.
Abu Ghraib.
I remember
The photos
this one.
from Abu Ghraib are widely known around the world for how disturbing they look, but the background is even darker. To the public, Abu Ghraib was a normal detention and interrogation facility, but it wasn't at all. Inside, there was sexual humiliation to lengths we can't go to for obvious reasons.
Right.
Torture, physical abuse, and rape. There was even the killing of Manadel al-Jamadi.
Yeah, they were using electric shocks. They were using objects to penetrate people. It was this, I remember, being really widely reported in the news. This is right around the time when people were starting to scrutinize kind of the ongoing occupation of Iraq and the methods that were being used to extract information from people.
Whose body was packed in ice and later photographed with soldiers posing
Yep,
beside it.
I remember
the
that.
shock was immediate and worldwide, so the Bush administration answered quickly, saying that these were isolated acts by a few rogue soldiers. However,
And that may very well be true. When you're talking about hundreds of thousands of soldiers, if you have a dozen or so that do this, it's a dozen or so too many, but it is an isolated thing in that case.
organizations like the Red Cross, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch said the opposite, claiming this was part of a larger pattern across U.S. prisons in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Guantanamo. The
Maybe.
Red Cross also reported that most Abu Ghraib detainees were civilians with no connection to armed groups. Then, internal documents showed how they were given approval for what were called enhanced interrogation techniques. These
Waterboarding.
documents would be later known as the torture memos, for reasons you can imagine. They argued that the Geneva Conventions didn't apply overseas and didn't classify the detainees as prisoners of war.
The Geneva Conventions are exactly meant to apply overseas. I mean, that's the whole point, is that they exist for international. I mean, because the Geneva Conventions apply to warfare, and that's almost always something that is fought somewhere else other than your own country.
Which allowed them to hold people longer without charges and deny them the rights normally given to prisoners of war.
And this is, again, why it gets so tricky when it comes to this irregular warfare. When you have people who are not uniformed members of a nation's military, that gives you the opportunity then to argue, well, the Geneva Conventions don't apply to them because those are things that apply to a nation's military in a declared war, none of which is the case here. And so you're always looking for those loopholes.
Orders showed Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez authorizing the use of dogs, extreme heat and cold, reversed sleep cycles, and sensory deprivation. Inside the cells, prisoners were stripped naked and forced into humiliating poses, threatened with dogs, beaten, shackled in painful positions, deprived of sleep and warmth, and forced into sexual acts. Taguba recorded one prisoner sodomized with a chemical light. Detainees spoke of acid poured on their skin, being dragged by ropes tied to their genitals, and being mocked. Manadel al-Jamadi, whose death was ruled a homicide, never led to any criminal charges. At the same time, 36 detainees died in insurgent mortar attacks on the prison, which critics said violated the Geneva rule that prisoners should not be kept in active combat zones. In 2006, the Supreme Court ruled that the Geneva Conventions did apply, and 17 soldiers and officers were removed, while 11 were court-martialed. The punishments varied. One guy got 10 years, some 3, and others shorter sentences, or even just reprimands or demotions. External contractors, such as the company CACI Premier Technology, also came under scrutiny.
And you notice that in a lot of these cases, many of these things only result in punishment when they're brought to light, when they are made public, if because they're trying to keep this stuff internal. The whole point of this is that while the United States is capable of tremendous good in the world, and I would argue, for example, that fighting World War II was tremendously good, within good happening in some of these scenarios, and of course all of these so far have been in wars that we could argue never should have happened anyway. But even in those kinds of situations, you can still have tremendous bad happening, and you can have a nation like the United States that doesn't want to look bad to the rest of the world doing everything they can to cover it up.
Pretty recently, in 2024, a jury found them liable for conspiring with military police to soften up prisoners through abuse, awarding 3 former detainees $42 million in damages.
Wow.
Jurors concluded that CACI interrogators facilitated mistreatment even if they did not personally carry it out. Operation Speedy Express. This was one of the most brutal and controversial U.S. campaigns of the Vietnam War. You can get an idea of what really happened when you hear that the Army reported about 11,000 enemy killed, but recovered only 750 weapons from the dead. Operation Speedy Express, carried out from December 1968 to May 1969, and run under Major General Julian Ewell, had the official goal of destroying Viet Cong bases, cutting supply lines, and re-establishing U.S. control over a region considered a stronghold of the Viet Cong, the Mekong Delta. On paper, the operation looked like an overwhelming success, considering that just 242 American soldiers died, while the enemy lost 11,000. With a ratio of 45-1, it looked like a decisive victory, but
And honestly, I mean, those numbers kind of play out over the course of the entire Vietnam War. I mean, the U.S. lost, just over 50, somewhere between 50 and 60,000 killed in Vietnam, and the number of dead was well over 1 million Vietnamese on both sides. So in the grand scheme of things, our losses were pretty minor, but still pretty horrific. But this kind of thing here, I think, is probably indicative of something that played out repeatedly during the Second World War with things like the firebombing of Japan and Germany.
numbers hid something darker. The fact that only about 750 weapons were recovered means that thousands of those killed were probably unarmed civilians. The Army's own Inspector General later estimated that between 5,000 and 7,000 civilians were killed during the operation. The campaign relied on overwhelming firepower, like helicopter gunships, artillery barrages, and fighter bomber strikes, in a heavily crowded region with civilians. This basically turned entire areas into free fire zones. David Hackworth, a highly decorated battalion commander, admitted openly, "A lot of innocent Vietnamese civilians got slaughtered because of the Yule Hunt drive to have the highest body count in the land." Survivors and witnesses described whole villages wiped out, with civilians getting shot from the air as they tried to run. A Viet Cong commander later explained, "Most of the people killed were civilians, because civilians would run. We soldiers held our positions." Reports of atrocities began to surface in 1969, but they were overshadowed by the My Lai massacre, which
Right.
we've just talked about. In 1972, Newsweek published an investigation by Kevin Buckley and Alexander Shimkin called Pacification's Deadly Price. They had
So can we just point out that in general, okay, not just war crimes, in general, war is awful. War is awful, and it is impossible to fight a war without civilians being caught in the middle. And I'm not saying that that justifies the U.S. doing this. The U.S. should not have been targeting civilians ever, 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 ever. But this is what happens in war. Civilians end up paying the price. You know, World War II, again, industrialized warfare. At some point, when you kill enough enemy soldiers, you start to say, well, you know what? The way we could really stop this is if we destroy their ability to continue fighting. So let's destroy their factories. Well, we've destroyed the factories, but now they're rebuilding the factories. So if destroying the factories doesn't work, how about we kill the people who are working in those factories so that they can't rebuild them, so that they can't make more bombs, so that they can't kill more of our people? And that's just kind of the way that the thought process works. And so always civilians end up paying the price for military action.
They interviewed villagers and studied hospital records. In one provincial hospital, they found that 3/4 of the civilian wounds treated came from U.S. firepower, not Viet Cong attacks. Their conclusion was that thousands of civilians had been killed during Speedy Express. No Gun Ri massacre.
This one
In
I
the
do
summer
know.
of 1950, During the Korean War, one of its darkest tragedies took place at a railway bridge near the village of No-Gun-ri. U.S. commanders were afraid that North Korean soldiers were disguising themselves as civilians, so they ordered refugee movements to be blocked. Declassified documents later showed that some commands actually went even further, authorizing troops to fire on groups of civilians who approached. Then, disaster struck. As waves of refugees fled south from the advancing North Korean army, they reached U.S. lines. There, they were stopped, searched, and grouped near the railway tracks by No-Gun-ri. American planes then shot at them. Survivors say ground troops soon opened fire too, driving them into the culverts and pinning them down in the bridge underpasses. Hundreds of South Korean refugees, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were caught under fire, and for 3 days, families screamed as they piled bodies on top of one another for cover, drank from a stream turned red with blood, and watched children die beside them. The death toll has long been debated, with survivors speaking of about 400 people killed, and U.S. veterans giving numbers ranging from dozens to several hundred. A South Korean government inquiry was able to confirm 163 people dead or missing by name, along with 55 wounded, and concluded that the real toll was likely much higher, around 250 to 300. Nearly half of the confirmed victims were children. For decades, the story was silenced, as survivors lived in fear under South Korea's authoritarian governments. It was not—
That's the one thing we forget about when it comes to the Korean conflict, is that both sides had authoritarian regimes at that time. We just happened to be fighting for the one that was not communist, and that was just part of the whole Cold War and the policy of containment. Vietnam is another aspect of that. Think about how much of this is going on at a time where we are trying to contain communism.
Until 1999 that the Associated Press exposed the story worldwide, interviewing survivors and U.S. veterans. The reporting won a Pulitzer Prize and forced both the U.S. and South Korean governments to investigate. The U.S. Army's 2001 report admitted that civilians had been killed by American air and ground fire, but claimed there had been no orders to deliberately massacre them. It described the killings as a tragic accident of war. President Bill Clinton—
Well, here's the thing. Just because orders weren't given doesn't mean that one of those pilots didn't take it upon themselves intentionally to do it. So does that make it an accident? Not really.
expressed deep regret and admitted things happened which were wrong. Instead of compensation, the U.S. funded a memorial and scholarships, which survivors rejected. South Korean investigators, however, concluded that there had almost certainly been orders to fire, pointing to missing records, consistent testimony, and orders from the time to treat refugees as enemy agents. Later, more declassified documents strengthened the case. One was a letter dated July 26, 1950, from the U.S. ambassador in Seoul, reporting that the U.S. military had adopted a policy of shooting refugee groups approaching its lines. This and other incriminating records had been deliberately left out of the Army's official report. No-Gun-ri also set off wider investigations in South Korea, uncovering more than 200 other cases of alleged U.S. killings of civilians in the—
So that's what I was saying earlier, is that there's probably so many of these that we don't know anything about. Because they were successfully covered up. Because look at how often it took years for the information to come out about the ones we do know about.
Early years of the war, including refugee bombings and mass executions. Sand Creek Massacre. On November 29, 1864, troops under Colonel John Chivington rode toward a Native American camp of the—
First of all, notice the date. This is 64. This is in the middle of the American Civil War. So we often forget when we talk about North versus South in the American Civil War that the United States military was still also dealing with what became the Plains Indians Wars later on. You know, we have a mass hanging that happens up in Minnesota. Guys like John Pope, who had been in command of a Union army in the East that was defeated at the Second Battle of Bull Run, he is then shipped out. And the reason you don't hear about him in the Civil War is because he was shipped out to go fight against Native Americans on the frontier.
Cheyenne and Arapaho people. Chief Black Kettle had moved his people there after being told it was safe, and he raised a U.S. flag with a white flag underneath it to show peace.
That to me seems about as reasonable as you can get as a Native American chief, to say, hey, we're friends, we're not fighting. You know, you've made that pretty clear in this point.
The warriors were away, and most of the people in camp were too old or too young to fight. Despite this, Chivington's soldiers attacked. Witnesses later described women and children being shot at close range, people cut apart with knives, babies killed, and bodies mutilated for trophies. One account told of a child wandering in the sand while soldiers took turns trying to shoot him. Another described fingers and ears cut off for jewelry and the body of Chief White Antelope butchered. By the time the killing ended, most of the dead were women and children. Chivington claimed that 500 to 600 warriors were killed, boasting about the number, but other sources said the real number was closer to 150, with about 2/3 women and children. The soldiers.
Now listen, I can already anticipate where the comment section is going to go with some of this. It's going to be, well, what about the atrocities committed by the Vietnamese? What about atrocities committed by the Koreans? What about atrocities committed by Native Americans? All true. Absolutely did happen. This particular video is talking about examples of when the United States military did that. It's not saying that it didn't happen on the other side too.
Suffered far fewer losses. Before leaving, they looted the lodges and returned to kill some of the wounded. The reason why this massacre happened in the first place is even sadder. In the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, the U.S. recognized a large Cheyenne and Arapaho homeland. But after the Colorado Gold Rush and new migration, they asked the natives for more land than was.
And this is exactly what triggers the Great Sioux War of 1876 as well. It's, oh, we gave you land. Yeah, we know, but oh gosh, there's gold on that land that we promised you could have. So we're going to have to revisit this treaty. And the Sioux were like, no, we're not doing this again. And they went to war.
Agreed, and a small group of chiefs signed the Fort Wise Treaty, ceding most of the land to appease the U.S. Many Cheyenne, though, rejected it as invalid, and tensions rose. The governor told friendly Indians to gather near forts in order to stay safe, and Colonel Chivington himself, while he declared openly that he had come to kill Indians, told those seeking peace to come under military protection at Fort Lyon. That's exactly what Black Kettle did, following his instructions.
He did everything that he was told to do. He did everything right in this scenario to protect his people, and they got killed anyway.
His people were pushed out. He still believed the U.S. and white flags would protect them, but the massacre happened. In Colorado and Washington, the story was first reported as a victory, but the truth quickly surfaced. 3 investigations followed, including a congressional inquiry that called it a foul and dastardly massacre. Officers and scouts testified about the killings and mutilations. Captain Soule, who had refused to fire, gave evidence and was murdered shortly after in Denver. Despite the findings, no one was court-martialed. Chivington had already resigned, and while his career ended in disgrace, he avoided legal punishment. A later treaty at the Little Arkansas.
So the only American that really paid for this was the guy who tried to do the right thing and got murdered for it.
Promised survivors land access and reparations, but those promises were soon broken and replaced with much smaller reservations. Philippines concentration camps.
Yeah.
During the Philippine-American War, concentration camps were used in Batangas, and one American officer described them as some suburb of hell. You'll soon understand why. Back then, General James Franklin Bell took command of U.S. forces in that area, and his goal was to starve the rebels and cut them off from any support. However, since there were many civilians there, they decided to put them into heavily guarded camps, as their homes, fields, and animals were destroyed. All civilians were required to carry identification papers, and anyone found outside the camps without them could be shot on the spot. Bell himself said neutrality should not be tolerated, which meant that everyone was either an enemy or a friend, and anyone accused of helping the rebels risked execution. Conditions inside the camps were catastrophic. People were packed together in crowded spaces with poor sanitation, which made diseases spread quickly. Cholera, smallpox, beriberi, and even bubonic plague.
So here's the thing, is that later on, you're going to have in the 1930s when the Germans start doing the same thing, they're actually going to point to what the Americans did, not only in places like the Philippines, but with Japanese Americans later on at the Nuremberg trials. They're going to say, well, you did it to Japanese Americans. Or they'll point to things like the way that African Americans are treated and say, you know what, we're not any different than you are. And, you know, while they took it much, much further to mass extermination, they had a point.
Killed thousands. Food was also scarce, and some soldiers described groups of men being forced to dig their own graves before being executed, with the excuse that keeping them alive would take food away from U.S. troops. Torture was also performed, such as waterboarding. The death toll was incredible. Between January and April 1902, 8,350 people died in the camps. In some camps, as many as 1 out of every 5 prisoners died. To calm public anger in the United States, the Army's top public relations officer tried to defend the camps. He claimed they were meant sent to protect friendly natives, feed them, and teach them better hygiene. However, this claim collapsed when reports from inside the camp surfaced, with letters from soldiers and witnesses. Wounded Knee Massacre. Before sunrise at Wounded Knee Creek, cavalry surrounded.
This is probably one of the most well-known of all of the war crimes committed by the U.S. military, and this is the 7th Cavalry. This is the same unit that a decade and a half earlier had a portion of it wiped out at Little Bighorn.
Founded the Native American band of Lakota and began collecting their guns. Tension grew as soldiers searched the people, and a deaf Lakota man named Black Coyote held onto his rifle, and during a struggle, it went off. In that instant, soldiers opened fire on the entire camp, even though most Lakota men had already been disarmed. The Army's Hotchkiss guns fired into the tents where women and children were hiding.
And why did all this, I mean, we're talking about 1890 here, right? I mean, this is pretty close to the modern era at this point. And one of the reasons why a lot of this goes down is because of this thing called the ghost dance that was misinterpreted by the U.S. military as an act of war, as an act of hostility. And it really wasn't that. Not directly. And so they're rounding up people, and there's a lot of tensions, and things are running very high. And in this scenario, this isn't a situation where people were ordered to go in and kill. It was that armed soldiers come in, they're trying to disarm people, and there's a misunderstanding, a gun goes off, and then very jumpy soldiers just start shooting and end up massacring a lot of people, and they end up giving out a bunch of medals of honor for this. And very recently in the news, they were reviewing this, and they've decided not to revoke the medals of honor that were given for Wounded Knee.
In less than an hour, more than 250 Lakota were killed or fatally wounded. 25 U.S. soldiers were also killed. Survivors tried to flee, but they were chased and shot, and some soldiers finished off the wounded where they lay. A blizzard followed the massacre, and 3 days later, civilians gathered the frozen bodies and placed them in a mass grave.
Yeah.
4 infants were found alive, still wrapped in their mothers' shawls. The Army removed Colonel Forsyth, who had led the operation, but later reinstated him. An inquiry criticized his tactics, but did not blame him. 19 medals of honor were then awarded for Wounded Knee. Native leaders and many others have condemned those awards for decades.
Agree.
But most recently, in 2025, the Defense Secretary announced the medals would not be revoked.
And understand, too, that at that time, the Medal of Honor didn't carry the same standard for earning it that it has today. I mean, there was an entire unit of soldiers who were promised medals of honor if they would just re-enlist during the Civil War, and I think those ones ended up being revoked. In the 1890s, there was a review, and a bunch of them were revoked. You could get a Medal of Honor for capturing an enemy flag. Thomas Custer, who was killed at Little Bighorn, got 2 Medals of Honor in the last week of the war, both for capturing flags.
If you want to discuss this video or suggest an
Okay, I think that was really well done. It's obviously an uncomfortable topic to talk about for anybody, especially as an American, but it's important for us to acknowledge that while I can love my country and be proud of many things my country did, we also have to acknowledge, as I said the other day, sometimes we do horrible things, and it should be acknowledged that that happens, and then we should do everything we can to make sure that people know about it so it doesn't happen again. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Thanks for watching.